Hello, listeners. Welcome to our Plankton episode.
This episode is basically a clipping of our interview with Mr. Justin, who is from NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration.
We hope you enjoy the episode. Now, moving on to the plankton questions. How many species of plankton are there? Are they just phytoplanktons and zooplanktons?
Yeah, so a few thoughts on kind of like plankton in general. So for your listeners, like plankton are kind of classically, we think of them as they're alive, they're in the water, and they drift around with the currents, right? Planktos comes from this Greek root, which means to wander. And there's another word for things that can swim called nekton that almost nobody uses, but plankton are the drifters and nekton are the swimmers. So that kind of gives you an idea of like what plankton are. Some of them are teeny tiny, microscopic, barely see them, submicroscopic, and then some of them are as big as I am or bigger, right? Like the big drifters are things that tend to be more like jellies, right, or gelatinous, that just drift around with the currents. So for a little like introduction, that's sort of what we're talking about with plankton. And there are some kind of main groups. Once we get into plankton, there's phytoplankton. They're the plant-like plankton that can photosynthesize. There's zooplankton, the animal plankton. And the zooplankton can be divided into two groups. Kind of think of one group as the plankton that are plankton their whole life. They always drift around. They never really settle down. And then there's another group that are just plankton for part of their life cycle. And so those are kind of the two main groups I think of are phytoplankton and zooplankton. And then within zooplankton, there's the ones that are plankton for their whole life. And then some that are just plankton for part of their life cycle. Then you start talking about species and wow, I mean, we really don't know, but as the science community, some folks estimate that there maybe 100,000 different species of phytoplankton. Yeah. So this is including things like the blue-green algae, the cyanobacteria. So some bacteria, algae like diatoms that surround themselves with those like glass-like structures, coccolithophores that have like calcium carbonate shells, and even tiny little things that are super abundant called Prochlorococcus. It was only discovered in the 1980s, but it's now thought of as one of the most abundant phytoplankton species. So there's just lots and lots and lots of different kinds of phytoplankton. And then with zooplankton, I think, it depends which source you look at, but it's thousands, but not 100,000 like that estimate for phytoplankton, maybe say 7 or 8 to 10,000 different kinds of zooplankton or zooplankton. But lots of them, lots of different kinds.
Thank you. What do planktons and zooplanktons eat?
It really depends on which one. So there are things like, they're just all the things that are drifting around in the water, and some of them are just completely different than each other. You can have two things on your microscope that are, say, this big, like not as this big in real life, but this big in your microscope view. And one of them might be an animal with thousands and thousands of cells. And the other one might be a phytoplankton, this marine algae that's one cell, and they're the same size. So they have totally different, different thing. You were asking what they eat. So like the plant-like plankton, they take nutrients from the water, and they need carbon dioxide, and they need sunlight, kind of like plants, so that they can photosynthesize. So that they're kind of eating the nutrients and using sunlight as their energy, but they're kind of making their own food. And then the animal plankton are either eating each other or maybe they're grazing on those phytoplankton.
What percentage of the primary consumers of the food chain eat planktons, and which plankton is eaten more?
Oh, that's a great question. I'd have to do some research on that. That's a very mathematical exercise, right? To do a lot of that calculating. First, you'd have to just kind of be like, how many things depend on primary productivity, and then what percent of that is plankton, is phytoplankton versus other kinds. So I don't know if I can get, but I can tell you that the phytoplankton is extremely important. It is the base of the food web.
Yes.
That is what is needed to feed everybody. And Greater Farallones and Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuaries are some of the most special pieces of, chunks of ocean and bays and estuaries and habitats in the world, because we have upwelling in our system. So we get nutrients that come up from the deep, and that comes up to the surface where we have all these phytoplankton and zooplankton that like to be near the surface. And the phytoplankton have sunlight and they have nutrients, and they can get carbon dioxide that's dissolved in the water, and they can just, their populations can grow and grow and grow. So it is so essential. I mean, it is what makes our ocean kind of world famous here in terms of productivity, is the upwelling, which drives all that primary productivity. And we get more than half the oxygen on the planet is coming from phytoplankton, or can be kind of connected back to phytoplankton. And in some cases, those estimates are higher than 50%. You hear a range of kind of 50 to 80%, depending on what you're referencing.
Can I ask a follow-up question, because I'm listening to you?
Yes, of course.
So you said 90% of it, it comes from the phytoplanktons, the oxygen. So is it more than the forests that are on the main surface?
It's interesting. I've heard 50 to 80%. So often if I'm teaching, I'll say more than 50% of the oxygen comes from the ocean. And so, that would be bigger than forests in terms of the impact on that. There's probably a chart that kind of breaks it down by habitat. But when I was growing up, there was so much focus on the rainforest and protecting the rainforest for oxygen.
Yes.
And, for not just oxygen, but for all kinds of reasons, for biodiversity. And I think now we're learning that the oceans are more important in terms of the oxygen cycle than we knew when we were focused on some of the other habitats in the 80s and early 90s.
These phytoplanktons actually do photosynthesis in the ocean?
So they are photosynthesizing in the ocean. And we're in a very beautiful and quiet kind of part of the city. So we have our own little parking lot we're near the Golden Gate Bridge. So if you've been out to Crissy Field, it's like this big historic airfield. Anyway, we collect plankton, and you can collect plankton right from the local piers. And then we have microscopes, and we can project microscopes. We have a plankton microscope on exhibit in our visitor center. So if you want to come up sometime to visit and see what these look like, the plankton are spectacular. My friend Janai, who I was going to try to get to join us for this podcast, she has a website called Pacific Plankton. And if you check out Pacific Plankton, you can see just beautiful image after image and videos of these weird and wonderful organisms. You can see the zooplankton and the phytoplankton. And what made me think of that is that if you saw these phytoplankton, you can see what looks kind of like the ocean version of the chloroplasts, right? So if you look at plant cells, they're very green. And if you look at a lot of marine plankton are kind of a more golden and brown color, but they can also be green colors. And you get these necklaces of chain diatoms and these jewels of these diatoms. It's just spectacular.
Wow. So, are there animals that eat both types of planktons, or just one or the other?
Yeah, great question. So there are ones that that are kind of omnivores that eat both. And then there are things that kind of specialize in just eating one or the other. A lot of the ways that things feed on plankton is by filtering the water. So things like mussels and clams and even sand crabs. Have you ever seen sand crabs before at the beach?
Have,
Kind
yeah.
of like in the wet sand. They're like these cool little.
Oh yeah, the
Like,
sand crabs. Yeah.
yeah. Some people call them Pacific mole crabs. They have like kind of secret antenna tucked inside their bodies that they wave back and forth underwater, and they collect all the plankton on their feathery antenna, and then they lick them off like one after the other. And things like mussels and clams, they suck in water and then they get all the nutrients from the plankton and then they spit the water back out. So for some animals, they might be there, maybe their gut is designed to try to eat more of the plant-like plankton, the phytoplankton. Some might be more hoping to get zooplankton. Often they kind of get it all. If they're kind of filtering the
Yeah.
water, they might end up accidentally collecting all of it. But there are definitely some things that want to eat a variety of plankton. It's a good question.
How do planktons reproduce?
Yeah, so in that same way that plankton are like a whole bunch of different phyla or a bunch of different, there's a lot of different types. There's invertebrates and vertebrates that can be plankton. So it kind of goes back to how like things are, there's like so much diversity. I guess maybe the best way to answer that is with a few examples. So it depends on what kind of plankton. Diatoms, which are a type of phytoplankton, a single diatom cell can divide and form two new cells. They call them daughter cells. And they can divide once every several weeks or as quickly as like once a day. So if the conditions are right, they can just reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. And if you're reproducing by splitting, that's like one way to reproduce. Other things will reproduce by they'll have eggs and they'll have sperm, and then they will fertilize the eggs. Some of the plankton carry clusters of eggs around with them, which is really interesting. Copepods, that the mama copepods, the female copepods will have little clusters of eggs that they carry behind them during some parts of the year. Rotifers do that too. They're another kind of zooplankton. And some of these plankton, remember, they're only drifters for part of their life cycle, as the maybe the larval or baby stage of their life cycle.
Yeah.
And crabs are a great example of this. Like the way crabs reproduce is like let's say like a sand crab that I was talking about before. They can have up to 40,000 eggs.
Wow. In
And
just
they're one mass of eggs. They'll have 40,000 eggs. They're bright orange when they first lay them, and they'll turn dark brown over 1 month. And then they drift around in the ocean for 4 months on average. And with any luck, they'll wash back to shore and they'll deposit down in the sand next to the adult, sand crabs if they're lucky. But if you're having 40,000 babies, most of them are not going to survive to adulthood.
Yeah, that's what I was
So,
thinking. So, like, what percentage of sand crabs actually do live to adulthood?
I mean, unless sand crab populations are increasing a lot or decreasing a lot, it's probably roughly replacement, right? So one or two of those 40,000, maybe in some cases zero, but in other cases 20, if that was like those were more lucky. So it's wild. Like Dungeness crabs, the bigger crabs, they can have 2.5 million, up to 2.5 million eggs that are all going to turn into these 2.5 million little zooplankton or zooplankton that are drifting off, probably never to see their parents again, don't really swim around with their brothers and sisters. They just get distributed throughout the currents and they're on their own. It's really wild.
Sorry, I know this interview is running along. So,
But
we only have a couple questions
questions?
yet. So, but this is really interesting for me, so thank you.
I can give you shorter answers too.
I love the details. Yes, we still have the time. If not, we could I could send you these questions and you could give me email answers. But if you're willing to if you're willing to keep going, we're like more than
Sure. Yeah, I think I have another 5 or 10 minutes
Oh,
if we could do it in that.
yeah, we have just like
Yeah.
4 or 5 more questions.
4.
Okay. Let's go for it.
When some animals start their life classified as plankton, does that mean they are at risk to be eaten by zooplankton?
The short answer is yes. Longer answer is that if something starts their life as plankton, they're at risk of being eaten by not just other zooplankton, but fish, filter feeders, like I was talking about, clams and mussels, things that have stinging cells and tentacles like anemones, all kinds of things, right? So that, like we talked about, that's part of the reason that Dungeness crab has 2.5 million eggs, is that there are other risks as well, not just being eaten by zooplankton, but maybe like a larva, which is what we call like a little baby plankton that or a baby invertebrate that doesn't look that much like its parent in those early stages. One of those larvae could drift into a part of the ocean that just doesn't have the food that it needs, or the right temperature, or the right oxygen levels. So there's a lot of sort of risks to being a plankton.
Wow. Well, I guess you already kind of mentioned this, but how does human interaction kill plankton other than forces of nature? Does the killing vary from species to species, or does it not like kill them at all?
Yeah, I think things that humans do that might affect plankton, it could really be species, like you said, species dependent, you know, but things like pollution or contamination of the water, since they live in the water, could definitely affect them. And even gradual changes to the climate, like I know you all know a bit about climate change. So things like ocean acidification or increases in sea surface temperature, those could affect plankton as well. And that's something that's tied to increased carbon dioxide due to human activity in the atmosphere.
So, Isha and I have actually been reading about the huge plankton booms because of global warming, climate change. So, how is this affecting the rest of the ecosystem currently?
Where does plankton bloom and live?
These are great questions. So we don't just call them blooms. We often talk about what you're talking about as harmful algal blooms, ones that kind of have like a negative consequence for that environment. Because sometimes when you have a harmful algal bloom, like you're talking about, it kills other wildlife that's in the water, right? And it can be kind of catastrophic, right, for that system. There's other times where we have plankton blooms that are kind of more in that healthy bloom. Like I was talking about off our coast, we have upwelling, which drives plankton reproducing and growing and reproducing like crazy. Kind of sounds like a bloom, right? Isn't that the thing that's a problem? Well, in that case, if it's in the right balance, it can be fine. Often the algal blooms happen when there's too much, due to humans, often too much of one of the nutrients like phosphorus or nitrogen. Sometimes that's from runoff from land, so from like farms or from near human activities, but often tied to agriculture. And if you have too much phosphorus or too much nitrogen available, and and there isn't a lot of mixing, a lot of new fresh water getting brought in, then things reproduce and reproduce, and eventually there's too many of them, and they can die all sort of at once, and that's what can lead to those harmful algal blooms. Also, there are some species of plankton that are a bigger concern than others in terms of human health. There's some plankton that if it gets concentrated in certain kinds of shellfish, you shouldn't eat those shellfish because it can affect our health or affect our brains. And so that's why there's some pretty strict rules about when you can collect mussels or other filter feeders for human consumption.
That's really interesting, actually. I never thought about it.
What makes a habitat ideal for plankton to thrive? Does this differentiate from the different types of plankton?
Yeah, those are great questions. So in general, for phytoplankton, you want sunlight, you want nutrients. So in a place like Greater Farallones and Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuaries and our other California marine sanctuaries like Monterey Bay and Channel Islands, those are great areas along our California coast because you get that nutrients from upwelling, from seasonal upwelling, not all the time, but just the right, like you're looking for seasonal upwelling. And you also need the right like salinity and temperature. So just like you said, it's not all plankton have the same ideal habitat. In fact, there's freshwater plankton that lives in freshwater ponds that would not like to be in the salt water. And some of the saltwater plankton I'm talking about, they would not like to be in fresh water. So that's great. And for zooplankton, they're similar. They want to have the right salinity and temperature, but they want lots and lots of food, right, available for them. Yeah. So again, a place where there's lots of phytoplankton or whatever their food source is.
Last question. How can we help conserve these planktons in the deep sea? Do you have any ideas what our listeners can do?
I mean, I think for plankton, I think it's important that we do our best to try to keep like water quality as good as it can be, so that the plankton don't have to live in contaminated water. So what are ways that we can kind of keep our waters clean? I don't know. There's lots of different ways we can do that. Making sure that that any treated water that's from like a water treatment plant has as much treatment as possible if that water is going to go back into the environment. In some cases, that means conserving water. Like if we use less water, then the sewer systems don't have to process as much water. It makes it a little easier for them to process what water they do receive. I think anything we can do to combat climate change is really important. I think that can help keep ocean acidification from being higher, and having the water, the pH level of the water go lower, by having less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So things like taking a walk or riding your bike or choosing not to go on a trip that you were maybe thinking about going to, or going to a closer location instead of a longer location. Yeah. So lots of things around travel. I try to do it on a daily basis. I've got one bicycle behind me, but another one in the garage that I rode today, and I find that's really good for my health, and it helps my stress levels, and it's good for the environment. So there's a lot, but I think and you've learned about lots of things that you can do to help in terms of reducing your carbon footprint and helping for climate change. I think supporting your sanctuaries is a great way, because we help protect these habitats, and sharing with people that we have these national marine sanctuaries, and people like me whose job all day long, 5 days a week, is to help educate people about them and help protect them. And I think so that encouraging people to get to know them, because if they don't know anything about the deep sea, it's hard to really want to protect it and identify with it in the same way. Something I can offer to you if you're interested is we have video of Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuary that is 360 video. You can either watch it on a computer, or you can look at it in the headsets if you come to the visitor center, and if it's okay with your parents. It's just really amazing to feel like you're scuba diving with these it's kind of like National Geographic type explorers. There's a group called the Bay Area Underwater Explorers who helped us get this video footage. They collected it because they're the expert scuba divers. And I've been teaching about Cordell Bank for a lot of my career, but to be able to experience it in the virtual reality, it's kind of amazing. And not that many people have had the opportunity. What'd you say, Isha?
She wants to experience it.
Yeah, I know. That's my turn to be tech
Possible
support.
there.
That'll be my turn to be the tech support. I'm looking at 4 headsets right now, but we have this new ability to kind of have people all see it synchronized all at the same time. So
Wow.
we could probably even if it's a little more in the future, we'll have some more headsets and you could even bring a few more families and people could all look at it together at once. We're kind of getting set up to do that.
Listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode on plankton.
Please make sure you check out Janai's website, Pacific Plankton, if you are interested to learn more and see amazing pictures. Also, the NOAA Visitor Center in San Francisco is open, so make sure you check it out.
I know we will be.
Bye.
Bye.